Where am I? It's pitch black, and I can't see anything. I, who had been knocked unconscious during my mother-in-law's funeral, awoke to find myself trapped in a cramped box-like space. I desperately tried to push and bang on the lid to open it. Then, I heard a man's voice approaching, saying, "Now, it's time for the cremation." And the box I was in started to rattle. Could it be, am I inside a coffin? It seemed they were about to cremate me, and I was utterly terrified. Was I about to be sent to the afterlife like this? I'm Jasmine. I married Brandon, who was 2 years older than me and worked at the city hall, when I was 24. Although we didn't live with his parents, his mother lived nearby. Jasmine, if you ever need anything, just let me know. My mother-in-law was always kind and easy to talk to. For me, who had lost my parents at a young age, she was like a real mother. At first, my husband and I lived happily together, but from the second year, conflicts increased due to his wasteful spending. You want living expenses. You're working full-time too, so you must have money, right? I've been paying for rent, utilities, and food all by myself since last year. I want you to share the burden properly. It's always money, money, money with you. Do you think I'm an ATM or something? Whenever I tried to discuss finances, Brandon would always deflect the conversation and shut himself in his room, so we couldn't have a proper discussion. Although Brandon had a stable income as a civil servant, he didn't contribute money to the household and often went out late at night. He would come home drunk in the middle of the night, emptying his wallet after treating his colleagues. This was no way to live. At my wit's end, I decided to work not only at my daytime job selling insurance but also at a pub at night. I reported this to my mother-in-law as well. You shouldn't push yourself so hard. I'll talk to Brandon about it. When she found out I had started working nights too, my usually quiet mother-in-law became furious. I've tried talking to him many times, but he won't listen. I see. I'm so sorry about my foolish son. If only my husband were still alive at a time like this. Maybe it's because I raised him poorly. Actually, my father-in-law had already passed away before I married Brandon. My distraught mother-in-law tried to offer financial assistance, but I couldn't burden her, who was living alone. I'll try to have a proper talk with Brandon again. Then at least let me drive you to and from the pub. I can't let you bear all the hardship. With my mother-in-law's help, I managed to earn enough to cover our living expenses. She was a good driver, and our conversations during the rides were lively and comforting. It seemed that my mother-in-law had been frequently warning Brandon about money matters, but his wasteful spending didn't stop. Hey, tomorrow's Mom's funeral, so get ready. What? What do you mean? One morning, just before leaving for work, Brandon casually informed me that his mother had passed away. Shocked, I pressed him for details, but Brandon just glared at me irritably. Shut up. Mom died in a car accident. Are you enjoying wasting my time before work? Can't you at least say, "Have a good day," or something? He snapped at me and left in a bad mood. This can't be happening to your mother. What exactly happened? I knew she was an excellent driver from when she drove me to and from the pub. No matter how many times I asked Brandon about the accident, he wouldn't tell me anything. I was overwhelmed by a profound sadness and despair, as if the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. I have a friend at the funeral home we're using, so make arrangements with him. I'm too busy with work. My husband left the house, dumping all the preparations on me, who was at a loss for words, with an annoyed look on his face. After that, I couldn't get in touch with him, and I spent my time preparing to bid farewell to my mother-in-law. The next day, Brandon showed up at the funeral home with a grin on his face. I noticed him and rushed over, but he wouldn't even make eye contact with me. "Where have you been? Your phone was off, and you stayed somewhere last night, didn't you?" "Not really." My husband refused to answer my questions. During the funeral, Brandon occasionally chatted with the attendees, but mostly just yawned. He even fell asleep at times. Don't you feel sad that such a kind mother-in-law is gone? I could only feel disappointed in my husband's behavior. At one point, he suddenly looked my way. "Go get the spare cigarettes and lighter from the car." I couldn't leave the chief mourner, Brandon, alone at the venue. Following his instructions, which came with an unusually harsh glare, I headed to the parking lot. I can't find them. I searched around the driver's seat but couldn't find anything, so I started looking in the back seat. Suddenly, the sunlight was blocked by something behind me, and my surroundings darkened. Is someone behind me? Just as I was about to turn around, I felt a dull sound and intense pain in my head, and everything went black. I lost consciousness before I could even understand what had happened. I don't know how much time had passed. I was awakened by a throbbing, intense headache. It was a place as dark as if my eyes were still closed. Where am I? When I tried to get up, I realized I seemed to be trapped in a narrow box-like space and couldn't move. I pushed and banged on the wall in front of me, trying to get out somehow. Then, I heard a man's voice approaching, saying, "Now, it's time for the cremation," and the box I was in started to rattle. Could it be, am I inside a coffin? At that moment, I realized I was about to be burned alive and was utterly terrified. "Let me out. I'm alive. Help." I banged on the coffin with all my might and shouted desperately. Then, I heard the surprised voices of the staff saying, "Hey, there's a sound coming from inside." The lid of the coffin was opened, and I was rescued. Although I had narrowly escaped cremation, I was trembling and pale, and the staff, perhaps out of sympathy, explained the situation to me. Apparently, my husband had requested that I be sent along with his beloved mother, and I had been rushed in for an urgent funeral. And what surprised me most was that I was supposed to have passed away after falling down the stairs. But I was hit when I was looking for cigarettes and a lighter in the car, wasn't I? How could this be? Considering that this happened in the small parking lot of the funeral home, I thought it must have been someone attending the funeral or a staff member who was suspicious. I asked the crematorium staff not to tell anyone that I had come back to life and to pretend to my husband that the cremation had been completed. Apparently, Brandon hadn't even attended his mother's cremation and had said he was going on a 3-day trip and asked for the ashes to be mailed to him. Is that even possible? I was a bit suspicious of his behavior, but to uncover the truth, it would be easier to pretend that the cremation had been completed, using Brandon's words. Then, a staff member revealed a shocking fact to me. What? That's terrible. I was furious at the horrendous incident. I decided in my heart to take revenge on a certain person. However, I still needed more preparation. I needed evidence to hand over to the police the person who had done such a terrible thing. While staying at a hotel, I went to various places, including law offices. And then, at my mother-in-law's house, I discovered something astonishing that she had left behind. With this much evidence gathered, all that was left was to corner that person. For days after being discovered at the crematorium, I decided to return home. When I entered the living room, there was my husband lying on the sofa. A Boston bag was thrown carelessly beside him. He must have just returned from his trip and taken time off work to rest. "Jasmine, why are you alive?" He saw me and shouted in surprise, nearly falling over. "I heard you were flirting with your mistress during the funeral home meeting." I came back from the afterlife because I was so angry. I glared at him, my eyes blazing with anger, and shouted even louder than Brandon's cry of surprise. Actually, the shocking fact I had heard from the staff when I woke up at the crematorium was about my husband's affair. Apparently, he had brought his mistress along, grinning and introducing her to the staff saying, "This is my girlfriend, we're about to go on a trip." I've never seen or heard of anyone bringing their mistress along when they're about to cremate their wife. You're the lowest of the low. I took out photos of evidence of the affair from my handbag and scattered them on the living room table. There were pictures of Brandon flirting with a woman and credit card statements. He stared wide-eyed at the mountain of documents. Actually, I had been investigating the 3-day trip Brandon had mentioned. I found out where they were staying from the first day's card transaction history and rushed there immediately. What I saw was my husband arm in arm with a young woman, looking lovey-dovey on a date. They dined at expensive restaurants, and he bought her luxury brand bags and accessories. "You were having an affair even while I was working day and night, and even when I was put in a coffin. You monster." "No, it was a business entertainment. I was asked to accompany the daughter of a client. It was tough, you know." Brandon tried to play it off, sweating nervously and averting his eyes. "Oh, is that so? I'm sorry for misunderstanding." "Of course. You're stupid but try to act smart, that's why you throw these ridiculous hysterics." When I pretended to be fooled and apologized, he suddenly became arrogant. This is how my husband always denied my personality, robbed me of my confidence and hope, and did whatever he wanted after squeezing money out of me. But this time, I won't lose. I had decided to fight to the end, for my mother-in-law's sake too. But I have even more evidence. Don't you want to hear your beloved mistress's voice? I smiled mischievously and showed him a voice recorder I took out of my bag. My husband looked at my hands and squinted suspiciously. I pressed the play button on the recorder and played the recorded audio. It was the mistress confessing her relationship with my husband. Actually, just before returning home that day, I had ambushed the mistress at her home. She was so surprised to see me, who was supposed to be dead and cremated, that she let out a scream. She must have thought I had come back as a ghost. "If you confess honestly, I'll forgive you with just compensation." When I threatened her, the woman trembled and cried out, "I'm sorry," with big tears. She spilled everything about what had happened so far, and I recorded her story. And there, It was revealed that the mistress was a staff member at the city hall where Brandon worked. She said she was persistently courted by my husband and, despite knowing he was married, ended up dating him due to his lavish gift attacks. Their relationship had started around the second year of our marriage, just when his wasteful spending began. The mistress cried and clung to me, saying, I couldn't refuse because he was so persistent. He gave me expensive brand gifts, so I thought it was just a bit of fun. The voice echoing in the living room said, It's not serious at all. I mean, come on, who would fall in love with an old man like that? No way. Brandon muttered and looked at me with an indescribable expression. So you were having an affair, but your partner didn't love you. Too bad after all that money you spent on her. I couldn't help but burst out laughing at my husband's pitiful state. Don't laugh. I gave her so many presents. She said she loved me. He stomped his feet, nearly in tears. But the recording continued to play, detailing his wasteful spending, and ended with the woman's scream, It was just for the money. That's really all it was. You foolishly existed and got into debt of $60,000 because of money troubles. You good for nothing. I thrust the loan document I had taken out of my bag in front of Brandon's face. I had found that paper when I searched his study during his trip. Furthermore, when I checked the credit card usage history on Brandon's computer, I found evidence of his extravagance over the past 2 years. The reason I couldn't get in touch with my husband from the day before to the day of his mother's funeral was that he had dumped the funeral preparations on me and gone on a trip with his mistress. Your mother must be crying in the afterlife. How much more unfilial can you be? It's not like I had to prepare for the ceremony or anything. You're exaggerating. As a wife, you should have been happy to take care of it. My husband started to abuse me, raising his voice as I accused him. Your lack of filial piety isn't just that. I know you did something even worse. When I glared at my husband with a demonic expression and shouted at him, he shuddered. You aimed for the inheritance to repay your debts. That's why you tampered with your mother's car to cause an accident, right? When I confronted him with the truth, Brandon turned pale and hung his head. Actually, while searching for the person who had hit me, I was able to hear details about the traffic accident that caused my mother-in-law's death from the funeral home staff. Apparently, my mother-in-law, who was a skilled driver, had mistaken the brake for the accelerator. As she was trying to park her car near a store close to her home, she broke through the parking lot fence and fell into the river flowing beyond it, never to return. Because a similar major accident due to pedal confusion had occurred in the same place a year ago, the police had concluded it was another case of mistaking the brake for the accelerator. Feeling that this was unlike my mother-in-law, I had been investigating the accident as well. I placed the results of the investigation of my mother-in-law's accident vehicle, which I had requested from a traffic accident investigation company, on the table while my husband watched with bated breath. Her accident vehicle had already been scrapped, but fortunately, it was still remaining at the scrap yard without being completely dismantled. I had secured the car and, using connections from the insurance company where I worked, had it thoroughly examined by a specialist company. The results showed that the brakes had been unnaturally tampered with to stop working. The car was in a state where it could have had an accident at any time. It could just be deterioration, couldn't it? Brandon, sweating profusely and with lips as white as his pale face, retorted. The investigation company preserved fingerprints that shouldn't have been there during normal driving. I showed my husband the photo attached to the documents. Judging from the size, they must be his. Upon seeing the fingerprints, my husband covered his face with his hands and fell silent. And then you targeted me next. I told Brandon in a quiet voice. Why would I target you? If it was for the inheritance, Mom alone would have been enough. My husband hurriedly denied it, spitting saliva as he spoke, but his voice was trembling and seemed about to fade away. I found these in your mother's drawer while you were enjoying your affair trip. I took out my mother-in-law's will and diary from my bag. These were the surprising things my mother-in-law had left behind. The diary was written in my mother-in-law's handwriting. Do not let my son with a wasteful habit inherit the estate. My inheritance goes to my hard-working daughter-in-law. And to ensure it would definitely be inherited, the name and contact information of the lawyer she had appointed as the executor of her will were also written. As soon as I saw this, it clicked. It was the same name as the middle-aged man Brandon had been eagerly talking to at his mother's funeral. Thinking he must be the lawyer, I immediately headed to his office. When I asked about my mother-in-law's will, he told me that Brandon had urged him to hurry the inheritance process at the funeral. The lawyer told you that according to the will, the inheritance goes to your wife, didn't he? And he said, I was asked to inform you after the funeral was over, so I was planning to tell you after this. When my husband heard this, he looked as if he was about to scream. When you found out you couldn't inherit the property you were counting on to repay your debts, you panicked and lured me into the car, hitting me from behind. Isn't that right? Even if you got rid of your mother, you couldn't get the inheritance. So you intended to silence me, who would inherit, to make sure it would be yours this time. When I stared straight at my husband and declared this, he hung his head. You can't say for sure that I did it. I've even secured the weapon. What? I wiped the blood off the ashtray and put it back in its place. How did you know? Oh my, how do you know the weapon was an ashtray? When I sharply questioned him, Brandon began to panic. Actually, during my husband's trip, I had investigated our home car where I had been hit, as well as the funeral home and parking lot. The inside of the car, which was usually messy, was unusually clean. There were no traces of blood, probably because he had it cleaned. I couldn't find anything that looked like a weapon, but I didn't give up and collected the car's floor mats. I looked around the funeral home too, but couldn't find any clues. Exhausted, I sat down on the curb in the parking lot. When I looked down in despair, I noticed glass fragments glittering in the grooves of the drain cover. Looking closer, the glass fragments had small red stains, and nearby there were small brown leaf-like fragments. I realized these might be tobacco leaves, and the fragments might be from an ashtray. I remembered that on the day of my mother-in-law's funeral, my husband had made a fuss asking, "Where can I smoke?" and staff had guided him to the smoking area on the rooftop terrace. When I went there, I indeed found glass ashtrays, and upon closer inspection, one of them had a chipped bottom. He might have tried to throw away the weapon once, smashing it on the ground, and that's when the blood-stained part chipped off a little. After explaining the situation, I borrowed that ashtray and, through my lawyer, had the evidence examined. It tested positive for my blood and my husband's fingerprints. It was you who hit me. My husband, with everything exposed, came crawling to me, scratching his head. I'm sorry. You're the only one I love. I was jealous that my friend had a mistress, so I imitated him. Look, that guy at the funeral home. He's an old friend of mine. As he was making all sorts of excuses, a call came in from the lawyer. After hearing the content of the call, I glared at my husband. You forged documents and conspired with that friend to try to burn me alive, didn't you? The lawyer had been checking how the city office was handling my supposed death. According to him, I wasn't recorded as deceased, but instead, a missing person report had been filed. Normally, a cremation permit is issued and you take a death certificate written by a doctor to the city office. However, Brandon, wanting to cremate quickly without going through a hospital, had abused his position as a city hall employee to create documents on his own. This forceful method had worked because the person in charge of arranging the cremation was my husband's friend. However, that person had been off sick since the day of my scheduled cremation. So while I was talking with my husband, the lawyer had gone to this person's house to talk and immediately called to report the content. Brandon's friend had become emaciated with guilt for helping to burn someone alive. He confessed that he had been threatened by my husband. I'll give you part of the inheritance as a reward. If you don't help, I'll expose your affair, and so he had helped arrange the cremation. When he was told I was alive, he cried with relief. The lawyer ended the call saying, I'm heading there with the police. We'll arrive soon. You're the lowest, making even your friend help with your evil deeds, trying to kill your mother and wife. Go to hell. When I shouted loudly, Brandon could no longer even come up with excuses and crouched down weakly on the spot. $50,000 in compensation. I'll also demand $10,000 in compensation from your mistress. Of course, I won't give you any of your mother's inheritance. Pay back the $60,000 debt yourself. Hearing my final words, my husband stared at me with wide eyes. No way. It's impossible to pay such a large sum. Please, forgive me. We're close, aren't we? With tears streaming down his face, Brandon inched closer to me, trying to grab my hand. However, I pushed him away with all my might. Don't think you can get away with consuming people with greed. Suffer for the rest of your life. When I spat these words at him, Brandon burst into tears, snot running down his face. After a while, the lawyer arrived with the police. Watching my husband being dragged away, I felt my heart lighten a little. Looking at the blue sky outside, I felt that my mother-in-law must be happy that I had solved the case. Afterwards, I immediately divorced Brandon. With his arrest, his affair was exposed at his workplace, and both he and his mistress were fired. Brandon is now facing trial. According to the lawyer, he might be behind bars for many years. Even if he gets out, he'll have to pay $50,000 in compensation and $60,000 in debt. He'll spend the rest of his life struggling with debt. On the other hand, I've fully recovered and regained stability in my life. I can now focus on work, and my insurance sales performance is good. Recently, I was headhunted by a foreign company. Moreover, an ex-boyfriend I reunited with at a class reunion offered to help with my career change, and things are going well in that area too. I think all this good fortune might be thanks to my mother-in-law watching over me from heaven. I'm considering donating my mother-in-law's inheritance without touching it, but that should be okay, right?